The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the quiet park where children laughed and played. Among them was Amara, a bright-eyed 10-year-old with an infectious smile. Her hair, styled into intricate braids adorned with colorful beads, bounced as she swung back and forth on the playground swing. The sound of the beads clinking together filled the air, blending with the cheerful chatter of kids around her. To Amara, it was just another peaceful afternoon in the park, a place she loved because it felt like freedom. But not everyone shared her joy. Across the park, Officer Mark Reynolds sat in his patrol car, his eyes scanning the area. He prided himself on keeping order in their small town, though his methods often leaned toward strictness rather than compassion. That day, something about the rhythmic jingling of Amara's beads caught his attention. At first, he dismissed it, but the noise grew louder in his mind until it became unbearable. To him, it wasn't just a harmless child's accessory. It was a disruption, an unnecessary disturbance to the otherwise calm environment. Frowning, Officer Reynolds stepped out of his car and marched toward the swings. His boots thudded heavily against the pavement, drawing curious glances from nearby parents and children. Amara barely noticed him at first, too absorbed in her game of swinging higher and higher. But when she finally looked up and saw the towering figure standing beside her, her laughter faded. She blinked up at him, confused and a little frightened by the stern expression on his face. "What's all that noise?" he barked, pointing at her braids. Amara froze, unsure how to respond. "It's my hair," she stammered, clutching the chains of the swing tightly. Officer Reynolds crossed his arms, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, it's too loud," he said firmly. "You need to stop making such a racket." Amara's heart sank. How could her hair be too loud? It didn't make sense. Before she could say anything else, he reached into his utility belt and pulled out a pair of scissors. Panic surged through her as she realized what he intended to do. "No, please," she cried, trying to shield her head with her hands. But Officer Reynolds ignored her protests. With quick, deliberate movements, he snipped away at her braids, one by one, leaving uneven strands behind. Tears streamed down Amara's face as she watched pieces of her carefully styled hair fall to the ground. Each cut felt like more than just losing her braids. It felt like losing a part of herself. Around them, other children stopped playing, staring in shock at the scene unfolding before them. Parents whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disapproval, while others looked away, unwilling to confront the uncomfortable truth of what they were witnessing. When he finished, Officer Reynolds straightened up, satisfied that the problem had been resolved. Without so much as an apology, he turned and walked back to his patrol car, leaving Amara sitting alone on the swing, her spirit crushed. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, a few brave kids approached her, offering words of comfort. One even handed her a tissue, which she accepted silently, still too stunned to speak. As the reality of what had happened began to sink in, anger simmered beneath the surface, not just in Amara, but in those who had witnessed the injustice. Little did Officer Reynolds know, his actions would set off a chain reaction that would change lives forever, including his own. Amara ran home as fast as her legs could carry her, tears streaming down her face and her heart pounding in her chest. When she burst through the front door, her mother, Michelle Johnson, was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Hearing the commotion, Michelle turned around, spatula in hand, only to see her daughter standing there, trembling and sobbing uncontrollably. "Amara, baby, what happened?" Michelle asked, rushing to her side. Between gasps for air, Amara tried to explain, pointing at her uneven hair. "A police officer. He cut my braids. Said they were too loud." Her voice trailed off into another wave of tears. Michelle's eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed with fury. She knelt down, pulling her daughter into a tight hug. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured, though inside, her blood boiled. No one should treat a child this way, especially not someone sworn to protect them. Once Amara calmed down enough to share more details, Michelle's anger turned into determination. She grabbed her phone and snapped pictures of Amara's shorn hair before wrapping her in a soft blanket and sitting her on the couch. "Stay here, baby. Mommy's going to take care of this," she said firmly. With that, Michelle stormed out of the house, heading straight to the local police station. At the station, Michelle demanded to speak to whoever was in charge. The receptionist, clearly uncomfortable, directed her to Lieutenant Harris, who listened to her story with an expression that shifted between skepticism and indifference. "Ma'am, I'm sure it was just a misunderstanding," he said dismissively. "Officers have to maintain order, and sometimes kids can be disruptive." Michelle couldn't believe what she was hearing. Disruptive? My daughter is 10 years old. Her hair isn't a crime. She shot back, her voice rising. Despite her frustration, the lieutenant refused to escalate the matter further. Frustrated but undeterred, Michelle left the station feeling more determined than ever to expose the injustice. Back at home, Michelle decided to take matters into her own hands. She sat Amara down again and gently encouraged her to recount the incident while recording it on her phone. Amara hesitated at first, still shaken by the memory, but eventually she spoke. Her voice wavered as she described how the officer had approached her, ignored her protests, and cut her braids without permission. By the end of the recording, both mother and daughter were in tears, but Michelle knew she had something powerful. Proof. That night, Michelle uploaded the video to social media, adding a heartfelt caption about the pain and humiliation her daughter had endured. Within hours, the post gained traction. Friends, family, and strangers alike shared it, expressing outrage over the officer's actions. Comments poured in from people across the country, many sharing their own stories of discrimination and abuse at the hands of law enforcement. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon it went viral. As the days passed, Michelle noticed a shift in the town's atmosphere. Neighbors who had previously kept to themselves began knocking on her door, offering support and solidarity. Parents started talking to their children about fairness and respect, using Amara's experience as a teaching moment. Meanwhile, activists from nearby cities reached out, offering resources and advice on how to hold the police department accountable. Despite the growing attention, Michelle remained focused on protecting her daughter. Amara, however, struggled to cope. Once a bubbly and outgoing child, she now avoided going outside, fearing judgment or ridicule. She stopped playing with her friends and spent most of her time curled up in her room, drawing pictures to express her emotions. One particularly haunting sketch showed a towering figure looming over a small girl, scissors gleaming ominously in hand. Seeing her daughter withdraw broke Michelle's heart, but it also strengthened her resolve. She vowed to fight not just for Amara, but for every child who might face similar treatment. This wasn't just about one bad decision by one misguided officer. It was about exposing the system that allowed such behavior to happen in the first place. As Michelle prepared for the battle ahead, she reminded herself why she was doing this: love for her daughter and hope for a better future. The viral video of Amara's tearful recounting spread like wildfire, igniting a storm of emotions across the town and beyond. What started as a personal tragedy for one family quickly became a rallying cry for justice and accountability. The small, quiet community was suddenly thrust into the national spotlight, with news crews setting up camp outside Michelle's home and reporters clamoring for interviews. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForAmara and #RespectOurChildren, amplifying calls for action against the officer responsible. Locally, tensions reached a boiling point. Activists from neighboring cities arrived to organize protests, urging residents to stand up against systemic racism and police misconduct. On a Saturday morning, hundreds of people gathered in the town square, holding signs that read, "Stop targeting our kids," and "No justice, no peace." The crowd included parents with young children, high school students, teachers, and even some sympathetic members of the local police force who believed change was long overdue. Amara's story resonated deeply because it highlighted a painful truth. No child should ever feel unsafe or humiliated simply for existing as they are. Many attendees shared their own experiences of bias and discrimination, creating an atmosphere of solidarity. A young boy named Marcus stepped onto the makeshift stage, clutching a poster with a drawing of braided hair. "I have braids too," he said softly, his voice trembling. "And I don't want anyone to cut mine off." Despite the growing outcry, the police department remained defensive. Lieutenant Harris held a press conference, flanked by other senior officers, insisting that Officer Reynolds had acted within his discretion. "This is an isolated incident," he declared, trying to sound reassuring. "We are investigating the matter thoroughly, but we must also remember that our officers work hard every day to keep this town safe." His words did little to quell the anger brewing among protesters. For many, the response felt dismissive, a clear indication that the department wasn't taking the situation seriously. Some accused the police of protecting their own instead of addressing the real issue: why a grown man thought it was acceptable to violate a child's dignity over something as trivial as beads in her hair. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, Officer Reynolds wrestled with guilt and fear. He watched snippets of the protests on TV, his stomach churning as he saw angry crowds chanting slogans demanding his removal. At first, he tried convincing himself that he'd done nothing wrong, that the girls' braids really were too noisy, and cutting them had been a necessary step to restore order. But deep down, doubt crept in. Images of Amara's tear-streaked face haunted him, making sleep nearly impossible. Back at home, Michelle continued to navigate the whirlwind of attention while shielding Amara from its harshest effects. Though grateful for the support pouring in, she worried about how all this scrutiny might impact her daughter. Amara still struggled to adjust, retreating further into herself each day. She barely spoke during meals and refused to return to the park where the incident occurred. One evening, Michelle found her curled up under the dining table, clutching her favorite stuffed animal. It broke her heart but reinforced her determination to see this through. As the days turned into weeks, the protests grew larger and more organized. Local leaders joined the movement, calling for sweeping reforms in policing practices and increased training on cultural sensitivity. Schools hosted discussions about race and identity, encouraging students to speak openly about their feelings. Even businesses got involved, donating funds to support families affected by similar incidents. Through it all, the question lingered in everyone's minds: would justice truly be served, or would the system once again fail those it claimed to protect? The answer seemed uncertain, but one thing was clear: the people of the town were no longer willing to stay silent. They had found their voice, and they weren't going to let it be silenced anytime soon. As the protests gained momentum, and the story of Amara's ordeal continued to dominate headlines, reporters began digging deeper into her background. Most people in the town knew her as a shy but sweet girl who loved art and playing outside, but there was one detail that had largely gone unnoticed: her father. Amara rarely spoke about him, and Michelle had kept his identity private, wanting to shield their daughter from unnecessary attention. But as journalists scoured public records and social media, they uncovered a surprising truth. Amara's father was none other than Senator Elijah Johnson, a well-known advocate for civil rights and equality. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community and beyond. Senator Johnson wasn't just any politician. He was a powerful voice in the fight against systemic racism and injustice. Known for his fiery speeches on Capitol Hill and his tireless efforts to push legislation protecting marginalized communities, he commanded respect across the nation. The irony of his own child becoming a victim of the very issues he fought against was not lost on anyone. Reporters scrambled to contact him, eager to hear his reaction to the incident. When news reached Senator Johnson, he was attending a conference in another state. At first, he thought it was a misunderstanding, a cruel joke or misinformation spread online. But when he saw the viral video of Amara recounting the incident, tears streaming down her face, his heart sank. He immediately canceled his remaining engagements and booked the next flight home. On the plane, he stared out the window, replaying the video in his mind. His little girl, the same child who used to sit on his shoulders during parades, looked so broken. It tore at him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. By the time he arrived back in his hometown, the entire nation seemed to be watching. Cameras flashed as he stepped off the plane, microphones thrust toward him from every direction. "Senator Johnson, what are your thoughts on the situation? Will you pursue legal action? How does this affect your stance on police reform?" Questions came fast and furious, but he held up a hand, signaling for silence. "I'll address everything soon," he said calmly, though his eyes betrayed the storm brewing inside him. "Right now, my priority is my daughter." Michelle met him at the airport, and together they drove to their house in tense silence. When they walked through the door, Amara ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. For a moment, all the weight of his responsibilities melted away as he hugged her tightly. "Daddy's here now," he whispered, kissing the top of her head. "Everything's going to be okay." Later that evening, after tucking Amara into bed, Senator Johnson sat down with Michelle to discuss their next steps. They both agreed that this wasn't just about punishing one officer. It was about exposing the larger problem and ensuring no other child would suffer like Amara had. "This is bigger than us," he told her firmly. "We have an opportunity to make real change, and I won't let it slip away." The following morning, Senator Johnson issued a statement calling for accountability and transparency. He announced plans to hold a press conference outside the police station, vowing to stand alongside activists, lawyers, and community members until justice was served. His words resonated far beyond the borders of their small town, galvanizing supporters nationwide. People admired his strength and compassion, seeing in him not just a grieving father, but a leader ready to fight for what was right. For Officer Reynolds, the discovery of Amara's connection to Senator Johnson added yet another layer of dread. As whispers of the senator's involvement spread through the department, he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Cutting a child's hair was bad enough, but humiliating the daughter of a prominent civil rights advocate, that was a line he never should have crossed. And now, there was no telling how far-reaching the consequences might be. The day of the press conference dawned gray and overcast, mirroring the tension hanging thick in the air. Senator Elijah Johnson stood tall on the steps outside the police station, flanked by a team of determined lawyers, passionate activists, and members of the community who had come to show their support. Behind him, a sea of people held signs that read "Justice for Amara" and "Enough is enough." Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing every moment as reporters jostled for the best angle. When Senator Johnson stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent. His voice was steady but carried an undeniable edge of emotion as he began to speak. "This isn't just about my daughter," he said, his gaze sweeping across the audience. "It's about every child who has ever been made to feel small, insignificant, or less than human because of the color of their skin, the texture of their hair, or the way they choose to express themselves." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. What happened to Amara wasn't just an act of cruelty. It was an act of prejudice, plain and simple, and we cannot allow it to go unchallenged. His speech struck a chord with everyone present. Some nodded vigorously, while others wiped away tears. When he finished speaking, the crowd erupted into applause, chanting his name and cheering for justice. Inside the police station, Officer Reynolds watched the broadcast on a small TV in the break room. Each word from Senator Johnson felt like a weight pressing down on him. For days, he'd been replaying the incident in his mind, trying to justify his actions to himself. But now, faced with the full force of the senator's righteous anger and the public's outrage, all his defenses crumbled. He realized, perhaps for the first time, the depth of the harm he had caused, not just to Amara, but to her entire family and the wider community. Desperate to salvage what little remained of his career and reputation, Reynolds decided to take a risk. Through a mutual acquaintance, he reached out to Senator Johnson, requesting a private meeting. At first, the senator hesitated. The thought of sitting face to face with the man who had hurt his daughter filled him with rage. But after much deliberation and some urging from Michelle, who believed in second chances, he agreed. If nothing else, he wanted to look Reynolds in the eye and make him understand the gravity of his actions. The meeting took place in a quiet corner of a local library, away from prying eyes. As Reynolds walked in, his hands trembled slightly, and his usual confident demeanor was nowhere to be found. Senator Johnson sat across from him, his expression unreadable. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Finally, Reynolds broke the silence. "Senator Johnson, I need to apologize," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "What I did to your daughter was wrong. So wrong. I can't even begin to imagine how she must have felt." Senator Johnson leaned forward, studying the officer intently. "Do you know why it was wrong?" he asked sharply. "Was it because she's a child? Because she's black? Or because you thought you could get away with it?" Reynolds flinched at the pointed questions. "All of that," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I let my biases cloud my judgment. I saw her braids and those beads, and instead of seeing a little girl having fun, I don't know what I saw, something that didn't fit my idea of order. And I reacted without thinking about the impact it would have." For a long moment, Senator Johnson said nothing. Then softly, he asked, "Do you regret it?" "Yes," Reynolds replied earnestly. "More than anything. I never meant to hurt her, or anyone. I've spent my whole life wanting to protect people, but now I see that I ended up hurting one of the most innocent among us." Senator Johnson sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. He knew forgiveness wouldn't come easily, not from Amara, not from Michelle, and certainly not from himself. But he also recognized that punishing Reynolds wouldn't undo the damage done. What mattered now was whether the officer was truly willing to change. "If you're serious about making things right," the senator said finally, "then you'll have to prove it. Not to me, but to the community. To kids like Amara. You'll have to work hard to earn back trust, and that won't happen overnight." Reynolds nodded solemnly, understanding the enormity of the task ahead. As they parted ways, Senator Johnson couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe this painful chapter could lead to something meaningful, a chance for growth, redemption, and real change. In the days following his meeting with Senator Johnson, Officer Mark Reynolds found himself at a crossroads. The weight of his actions, and the consequences they had sparked, pressed heavily on him. For years, he had prided himself on being a man of authority, someone who upheld the law and maintained order. But now he saw himself through the eyes of others, as a symbol of prejudice, an enforcer of rules rooted in bias rather than fairness. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it also lit a flicker of determination within him. If he wanted to salvage any part of his life or career, he would need to confront his flaws head-on. Senator Johnson kept his word and gave Reynolds a chance to make amends, though not without strict conditions. Under the senator's guidance, Reynolds enrolled in mandatory anti-racism workshops hosted by local activists. These sessions were eye-opening and often uncomfortable for him. He sat alongside teachers, business owners, and other community members, listening to personal stories of discrimination and marginalization. One woman recounted how her son had been suspended from school for wearing his hair in dreadlocks, while another shared how she'd been followed around a store simply because of the color of her skin. Each story chipped away at Reynolds' defenses, forcing him to acknowledge the systemic inequalities he had once dismissed as exaggerated complaints. Beyond the workshops, Reynolds began volunteering at a youth center in one of the town's underserved neighborhoods. At first, the kids eyed him warily, their mistrust evident in their crossed arms and sidelong glances. But slowly, through consistent effort and genuine humility, he started to break down those walls. He helped coach basketball games, assisted with art projects, and even joined in dance-offs during Friday night events. Though awkward at times, these interactions taught him something profound: the value of seeing people, not just uniforms, hairstyles, or backgrounds, but individuals with dreams, fears, and humanity. Meanwhile, Amara continued to struggle emotionally. While she appreciated the outpouring of support from strangers, she still harbored deep resentment toward the officer who had humiliated her. Michelle tried to encourage forgiveness, reminding her that holding on to anger would only weigh her down. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened," Michelle told her gently one evening. "But sometimes, hating someone gives them power over you. Don't let him take anything else from you." It wasn't easy, but Amara eventually agreed to meet Reynolds face to face, albeit reluctantly. The encounter took place in a neutral setting, a quiet room at the library, where Senator Johnson had mediated their initial discussion. When Reynolds walked in, he looked nothing like the imposing figure Amara remembered. His shoulders slumped, and his usual stern demeanor was replaced by visible remorse. "Amara," he began, his voice trembling, "I want to say I'm sorry. For everything. What I did to you was wrong, and I'll carry that regret for the rest of my life." Amara didn't respond immediately. She stared at him, searching for sincerity in his eyes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, "Why did you do it?" Her question hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Reynolds swallowed hard. "Because I was ignorant," he admitted. "I didn't see you as a person. I saw you as a problem. And that's on me. I promise you, I'm working to be better, to see people for who they are, not what I think they should be." Though forgiveness didn't come easily, Amara nodded slightly, signaling that she heard him. It wasn't an absolution, but it was a start. For Reynolds, that small gesture meant more than words could express. It was a reminder that redemption wasn't earned overnight. It required patience, persistence, and proof of change. As weeks turned into months, the town began to notice a shift in Officer Reynolds. He no longer patrolled with the same rigid authority. Instead, he approached situations with empathy and understanding. Parents who once avoided him now greeted him warmly, and children who used to fear him waved hello as he passed by. Though scars remained, both for Amara and the community, the seeds of healing had been planted. And for the first time in a long while, there was hope that true transformation was possible. Months after the incident that shook the town, a sense of cautious optimism began to take root. The protests had subsided, replaced by constructive conversations about race, identity, and policing. The unity event planned by local leaders aimed to bring people together, not just to celebrate diversity, but to acknowledge the progress made and the work still ahead. It was held in the same park where Amara's braids had been cut, a deliberate choice meant to reclaim the space as one of joy and resilience rather than pain. The day of the event arrived, bright and sunny, with families streaming into the park carrying picnic blankets, balloons, and homemade signs promoting peace and inclusion. Booths lined the pathways, offering art activities for kids, free books on racial equity, and resources for mental health support. A stage stood at the center, adorned with colorful banners reading "Together We Rise" and "Love Over Hate." Music played softly in the background, blending with laughter and chatter. Amara stood backstage, clutching a piece of paper tightly in her hands. She had written a poem, a deeply personal reflection on what she'd endured and how she was learning to heal. Her mother and father stood beside her, offering quiet encouragement. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," Michelle whispered, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. But Amara shook her head. "I want to," she said softly. "It's my story, and I want to share it." When it was time, Senator Johnson introduced his daughter to the crowd. "This is Amara," he said, his voice filled with pride. "She's brave, strong, and wise beyond her years. Today, she'll speak for herself, and for every child who deserves to be seen, heard, and respected." The audience erupted into applause as Amara stepped onto the stage, her heart pounding. For a moment, she hesitated, looking out at the sea of faces. Then she took a deep breath and began to read. Her words were simple yet powerful, painting a vivid picture of loss, pain, and eventual hope. She spoke of feeling small and powerless when her braids were cut, of nights spent crying herself to sleep, and of slowly finding strength through love and support. By the end of the poem, tears glistened in her eyes, but so did determination. When she finished, the crowd rose to their feet, cheering and clapping long after her final line. Amara smiled shyly, bowing her head as her parents embraced her. Officer Reynolds attended the event too, standing near the back of the crowd. He watched Amara's performance with a lump in his throat, moved by her courage and grace. Though many attendees still eyed him warily, some nodded in acknowledgement of his efforts to change. Over the past months, he had worked tirelessly to rebuild trust, attending community meetings, mentoring teens at the youth center, and even organizing a program to teach officers about cultural sensitivity. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. After the speeches and performances, Reynolds approached Michelle and Senator Johnson. "Thank you," he said sincerely, addressing them both, "for giving me a chance to make things right. And thank you, Amara," he added, kneeling slightly to meet her gaze. "Your strength inspires me to keep doing better." Amara didn't respond immediately, but after a pause, she gave him a small nod. It wasn't forgiveness, perhaps it never would be, but it was acceptance, and sometimes that was enough. As the sun set over the park, casting golden light across the festivities, there was a shared understanding among everyone present. Healing wasn't linear. Scars remained, reminders of wounds that might never fully fade. But the town had taken meaningful steps toward change, driven by compassion, accountability, and a collective desire for justice. For the first time in a long while, the future felt brighter, a testament to the power of resilience and unity. The Unity event marked a turning point for the town, but it was only the beginning of a much longer journey. In the weeks and months that followed, the community continued to build on the momentum sparked by Amara's story. Conversations once avoided, about race, privilege, and systemic inequality, became regular topics at school board meetings, church gatherings, and even casual conversations over coffee. People were no longer afraid to ask hard questions or admit their own biases. Slowly but surely, walls began to crumble, replaced by bridges of understanding. Amara herself blossomed in ways her family hadn't dared hope for after the incident. With the support of art therapy sessions and her growing network of friends, she rediscovered her love for creativity. Her sketchbook, once filled with dark images of fear and sadness, now brimmed with vibrant drawings of nature, music notes, and smiling faces. One of her pieces, a colorful self-portrait featuring flowing braids adorned with beads, was selected for display at a local art gallery celebrating young talent. On opening night, as Amara stood proudly beside her artwork, surrounded by admirers, Michelle and Senator Johnson exchanged a teary-eyed glance. Their daughter was finding her voice again, stronger than ever. Meanwhile, Officer Reynolds remained steadfast in his commitment to change, not just within himself, but within the police department as well. He became an advocate for reform, pushing for mandatory diversity training and community engagement programs for all officers. At first, his colleagues were skeptical, dismissing his efforts as unnecessary or overly idealistic. But as he shared stories from his time at the youth center and recounted lessons learned during anti-racism workshops, some began to listen. Change was slow, but it was happening. One conversation, one policy adjustment, one act of kindness at a time. The town itself underwent subtle yet significant transformations. The park where Amara had been humiliated was renamed Unity Park, with new murals painted along its fences depicting themes of inclusion and harmony. A plaque near the swings honored Amara's courage, serving as both a reminder of past injustices and a symbol of hope for a brighter future. Parents brought their children to play there, using the space as an opportunity to teach them about empathy and respect. For Senator Johnson, the experience reinforced his belief in the power of collective action. Though he had always fought for justice on Capitol Hill, seeing firsthand how grassroots movements could drive meaningful change inspired him to strengthen ties between policymakers and local communities. He launched a statewide initiative aimed at addressing racial bias in law enforcement, drawing inspiration from the lessons learned in his hometown. His work earned widespread recognition, but he never forgot that it all started with a little girl whose bravery had ignited a movement. As for Michelle, she found solace in knowing that her decision to share Amara's story had made a difference, not just for her family, but for countless others who felt seen and validated because of it. She often reminded Amara that speaking up wasn't easy, but it was always worth it. "Your voice matters," she'd say. Never forget that. In quieter moments, when the chaos of those early days felt like a distant memory, Amara would sit under the stars with her father, talking about everything and nothing. One evening, she turned to him and asked, "Do you think people will remember what happened?" Senator Johnson smiled thoughtfully before replying, "They'll remember, not because of what was done to you, but because of how we chose to respond. We didn't let hate win. That's something worth remembering." And so, life moved forward. The scars remained, faint reminders of pain endured, but they no longer defined the town or Amara. Instead, they served as testaments to resilience, proof that even in the face of injustice, compassion and courage could pave the way for healing. True justice, as Senator Johnson often said, wasn't about revenge. It was about transformation, for individuals, communities, and society as a whole. And in this small town, that transformation had taken root, spreading outward like ripples in a pond, carrying hope wherever it went.